My name is Olivia. For years, I've been a single mother, fiercely devoted to my son Jamie. I'd already survived the failure of my first marriage and came out stronger, wiser, and more independent. And then I met Brian. Brian swept into my life like a breath of fresh air. He was attentive, charming, and on the surface, a perfectly stable man. For once, I felt like I could finally exhale, release the breath I'd been holding throughout years of struggle and hardship. I thought I was opening a new chapter in my life, one filled with love, happiness, and companionship. If only I had looked deeper. The first signal that everything wasn't as rosy as it seemed came during our wedding ceremony. I had carefully picked out a modest yet elegant dress, hoping to impress my soon-be family. However, the first thing that greeted me as I entered the hall was the disdainful gaze of Janet, Brian's mother. "Really, you're wearing that? My Brian could have anyone he wants, you know," she whispered as she passed by me to take her seat. I tried to shake off her comment, telling myself it was just nerves. But deep down, I felt the first twinges of unease, like a soft whisper in the wind warning of an impending storm. During the reception, as I was making my way back from the restroom, I overheard a conversation between Brian and Janet. "Are you sure about this, Brian?" Janet's voice oozed concern. "She's a divorcee with a child. What do you think you're getting into?" "Mom, Olivia is a great woman and I love her," Brian defended. But his voice lacked conviction. "I just hope you know what you're doing," Janet responded, her tone dripping with skepticism. As I came into view, they quickly changed the subject, plastering smiles on their faces. I wanted to call them out right then and there, but I held back, convincing myself that confronting them on our wedding day would be a mistake. Instead, I smiled back and compartmentalized my growing apprehensions, tucking them away like old photos in a drawer, out of sight, but never truly gone. When the wedding was over, I thought I could focus on my new life. I had Jamie to think about, after all. He was already having a hard time adjusting to Brian, and the last thing I wanted was to introduce more chaos into his life. But the seeds of doubt and worry had already been sown. As I stepped into the home that Brian and I would now share, my home that was no longer just Jamie's and mine, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I had walked into a minefield. I glanced at a picture of Jamie and me taken during a beach outing last summer. His smile was wide, unburdened by the complexities that adults often carry. I looked into his eyes in the photograph and made a silent promise. I would protect him, no matter what it took. And so, with my hopes high, but my gut twisted in knots of worry, I began this new chapter. A chapter that would test me in ways I couldn't yet imagine. A chapter that began with a wedding, but would lead to battles that neither vows nor rings could fortify me against. I had no idea that my life, which seemed to be aligning so well, was, in fact, teetering on the edge of a precipice. Little did I know, the true beginning of my undoing had just unfolded. After the honeymoon phase, which frankly felt more like a ceasefire, real life began to set in. I was back to my job, Jamie was back at school, and Brian went about his business as though our home was just a pit stop in his daily grind. But whenever Janet came over, the air grew thick with tension. It was as if a dark cloud hung over the house, casting shadows on whatever semblance of happiness we had managed to muster. "Olivia, do you actually allow Jamie to leave his toys everywhere like this?" Janet's voice dripped with disdain as she stepped into our living room one evening, unannounced as usual. She picked up a toy truck that Jamie had been playing with earlier and examined it like it was a piece of evidence in a crime scene. "He's a kid, Janet. Kids play," I replied, trying to keep the annoyance out of my voice. "Maybe in your world," she retorted, placing the toy back with exaggerated care, as if it were contaminated. "In my world, children are seen and not heard." Brian, who had been quietly observing our exchange, chose this moment to chime in. "Mom has a point, Olivia. Maybe it's time you taught Jamie some discipline. He's 8, not a toddler." I looked at him incredulously. This was the man I had married, who took his mother's side over his wife and stepson. "Discipline is one thing, Brian, but stifling a child's creativity and freedom is another." "Ah, the classic single mother excuse," Janet sneered. "If you had been a better disciplinarian, maybe your first marriage wouldn't have failed." I felt a boiling rage begin to surface, but I swallowed it down. For Jamie's sake, I told myself, "My first marriage has nothing to do with this," I managed to say, though my voice quivered with suppressed anger. The evening wore on, and dinner became another battlefield. Janet criticized everything from the seasoning of the chicken to the choice of wine. "This Chardonnay is too sweet, don't you think?" she commented, swirling the wine in her glass as though she were a sommelier. "I happen to like it, and so does Brian," I defended, trying to catch my husband's eye for support. Brian hesitated, glanced at his mother, and then back at me. "Well, it's not the best I've had, but it's good enough," he finally said. "Good enough," Janet echoed, as if those were the most abhorrent words she'd ever heard. My son deserves better than good enough. By the end of the evening, I felt emotionally drained, like a soldier retreating from a losing battle. As Janet finally left, announcing that she would return soon to ensure things were being run properly, I felt a dread settle into the pit of my stomach. I realized then that this wasn't just a struggle with Janet. It was a struggle for control, for respect, and for the sanctity of my own home. As I cleaned up the dinner table, throwing away the remnants of the meal that had turned into another point of contention, I looked at Jamie. He had been quiet throughout dinner, sensing the tension but not understanding the complexities. He deserved a peaceful home, not a war zone. And as I tucked him into bed that night, reading him his favorite bedtime story and watching his eyes slowly close in innocent slumber, I felt a resolute determination solidify within me. This was a war, and for Jamie's sake and my own, it was a war I was prepared to fight. I just hadn't figured out yet how far I'd have to go, or the costs I'd have to bear. For weeks, I navigated the icy terrain of my new life, carefully tiptoeing around the emotional landmines that seemed to multiply with each visit from Janet. She never missed an opportunity to undermine me, whether it was offering unsolicited advice about my cooking or subtly assaulting my parenting. Brian remained frustratingly passive, always avoiding conflict rather than taking a stand. Things took a turn for the worse one fateful winter afternoon when an unavoidable work commitment came up. Normally, I'd leave Jamie with a babysitter, but on that day, every option fell through. That's when Brian suggested the unthinkable. "Why don't you leave Jamie with my mom? She's free today." I hesitated. My gut screamed, no, but the reality was that I was backed into a corner. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I finally asked. "She's his grandmother, Olivia. What could go wrong?" Brian reasoned. With no alternative, I made the ill-fated decision to take Jamie to Janet's house. "Now call me as soon as you get there," I instructed him, handing over his cell phone as I dropped him near her place. "I will, Mom," Jamie promised, his eyes a little anxious but trusting. As I drove away, something felt ominously off, but work pressures pushed my concerns to the back of my mind. The day was hectic, filled with meetings and deadlines. Yet, as the hours ticked by, my phone remained conspicuously silent. No call from Jamie. I tried calling him multiple times, but each call went straight to voicemail. A cold dread filled me. I wrapped up work as quickly as I could and rushed home, my thoughts racing faster than my car's wheels. Once home, the empty silence of the house struck me like a physical blow. Still no Jamie. My heart pounded in my chest as I dialed his number again. Still disconnected. Just when I thought I would collapse under the weight of my growing panic, the front door creaked open. Jamie staggered in, his face flushed from the cold, his fingers tinged with an alarming shade of blue. "Mom, I'm so cold," he stammered, his teeth chattering. I rushed to him, wrapping him in a blanket, before speeding to the hospital. Thankfully, we had made it in time to prevent frostbite, but the doctor confirmed that Jamie had been dangerously close to severe hypothermia. As we drove back, Jamie finally opened up about what had happened. Grandma took away my phone as soon as I walked in. She said I didn't need it. Then she told me to leave and locked the door. I had to walk back, Mom. It was so cold. A fire ignited within me as I listened to Jamie's words, each one adding fuel to the blaze of my fury. Janet had not just crossed a line. She had launched an attack on my world, endangering the one person I held dear. Brian was no less culpable. By standing by his mother, by doubting me, he had shown his true colors. I had been a fool to think he could be a loving husband or a good father to Jamie. As I pulled into our driveway, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, I made up my mind. This couldn't go on. A reckoning was long overdue, and I was done playing defense. It was time for Janet to face the consequences of her actions, and for Brian to realize the cost of his inaction. The lines were drawn, the battle lines clear, and this time I was going on the offensive. The ill-fated decision of that day was going to set in motion a series of events that would change the landscape of our lives forever. And I was ready. The day after the hospital visit was surreal. The tension in the house was a palpable entity, hovering like a heavy fog. Jamie was understandably wary, avoiding eye contact with Brian, who seemed more distant than ever. I watched him walk around the house, guilt written all over his face, yet unable to utter even a single word of apology. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. The caller I read Janet. "Hello," I answered, my voice as cold as the winter air outside. "Olivia, darling, how's Jamie?" "I heard about the little incident," she cooed, each word dripping with fox concern. "You endangered my child, Janet," I said, cutting through her act. "This is beyond unforgivable." "Oh, children are resilient. He'll get over it," she replied, dismissive as ever. Your lease, I said, shifting gears. It's with a friend of mine, as you know. I've informed him of what happened. I think you'll find it difficult to continue staying there. I heard her choke on the other end of the line. You wouldn't dare, she stammered. I already have. Goodbye, Janet. Hanging up, I felt an odd mixture of satisfaction and dread. I knew I had set in motion something unstoppable. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was from my friend who owned Janet's rental property. I got your message, he texted. Don't worry, the eviction process has started. The news should made me feel victorious, but it didn't. Because when I looked at Jamie, still visibly shaken, and at Brian, who had just received a scathing call from his now homeless mother, I realized that winning a battle is not the same as winning a war. Brian finally broke his silence later that night. You evicted my mother? I did, I responded, bracing for impact. That's extreme, don't you think? Extreme situations call for extreme measures, I shot back. Your mother endangered Jamie. Our son could have died. He's not my son, Brian muttered, almost under his breath. And there it was, the chilling return of the truth, a blade that cut through any illusion I had left about our marriage. Brian had never seen Jamie as a son, never seen me as an equal partner in this relationship, and he had never stood up to his mother because he had never really stood with us. You're right, I said, looking him in the eye. He's not your son. Brian looked stricken but said nothing. It was in that chilling moment that I realized the extent of the rift between us. Janet was not the only enemy in this war. My own husband, the man I had vowed to share my life with, had become a battleground of his own. And like any battleground, he was filled with traps and betrayals, hidden behind a facade of normalcy. The chilling return to our cold, loveless reality was more painful than any argument or insult. It was the painful understanding that the war zone extended far beyond Janet and into the very foundations of my marriage. It was a devastating blow, but also a clarifying one. As I walked away from Brian, leaving him alone in the living room, I realized that the battle lines had shifted. My focus had to expand beyond defeating Janet to reevaluating the crumbling marriage that had allowed her cruelty to flourish. I had won the battle, but the war had just begun, and this time I was fighting on multiple fronts. With the eviction proceedings in motion, I knew that Janet's departure from her rental was imminent. But eviction was just a part of the multi-front war I was now fighting. It was high time for legal consequences, for both her and Brian. I couldn't allow Jamie to continue living in a toxic environment, nor could I let myself remain ensnared in a loveless marriage. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in family law and briefly summarized the situation. We need to protect Jamie, I told her, and ensure that Brian's mother can't get close to him again. Don't worry, Olivia. We can file a restraining order, and given the circumstances, it's highly likely to be granted, she assured me. And the divorce, I pressed. We'll file for that too. With your child endangered by his family, custody will be straightforward. The legal wheels began turning, but as they did, a greater reckoning loomed in the background. Brian, upon learning of my actions, became even more distant. He was lost in a world of his making, unable to come to grips with the reality of what his mother had done and what it had cost him. One evening, he confronted me. You're tearing this family apart. A divorce. Really, Olivia? Family. Is that what you call this, Brian? Your mother almost killed Jamie and you did nothing. I was caught in the middle. You chose your side when you let your mother treat us like this, I retorted. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a message from the police, confirming that Janet had been arrested on charges of child endangerment. Soon after, another message popped up. My friend had successfully evicted her. The wave of vindication washed over me, but it was cold comfort. I looked at Brian and realized he was not just a man caught in the middle. He was a man who had chosen the wrong side, and now he had to live with the consequences. 2 weeks later, we were in court. With damning evidence and testimony, Janet was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Her face, as the judge read out the sentence, was a mask of disbelief. She had never thought she'd be held accountable for her actions, and the shock of her new reality was almost palpable. During the same period, the divorce proceedings moved at a rapid pace. The evidence against Brian's capability as a spouse and a stepfather was overwhelming. Even he couldn't deny the truth, as it was laid bare in legal documents and court hearings. The judge granted me full custody of Jamie, while Brian was given minimal visitation rights under supervised conditions. The house, which was in my name, naturally stayed with me, while Brian was ordered to move out immediately. As I stood outside the courtroom, the finality of it all sinking in, I received a call. It was from my lawyer. How does it feel to be free? She asked. Like a dish best served cold, I replied, my eyes meeting Brian's for a brief moment, before he walked away, broken and defeated. I had won, but it was a cold victory, devoid of the happiness or relief one would expect. Janet was behind bars, Brian was out of my life, and Jamie was safe. Yet, as I left the courthouse, I couldn't help but think of the high cost of this war, the destruction of a marriage, the estrangement of family, and a young boy who had to see the darker aspects of life far too early. Revenge was indeed a dish best served cold, but it was a meal that left me with a lingering bitterness, a lasting reminder of the complexity and the cost of the battles we choose to fight. Still, if asked whether I would do it again, my answer would be a resounding yes. For Jamie's safety, for my own self-respect, I had done what was necessary. But as I hugged Jamie tight that night, I knew that the road ahead was a long one, filled with healing and rediscovery for both of us. And so, as one chapter closed, another began. I was free, but freedom came with its own set of challenges and responsibilities. The war was over, but the reconstruction had just begun. And this time, I was determined to build something enduring, something that no one could ever tear down again. The weeks following the divorce and Janet's sentencing were an emotional whirlwind. Adjusting to single motherhood while also navigating the aftermath of a bitter legal battle was no easy feat. On the surface, I had won. Janet was behind bars. Brian was out of our lives and Jamie was safe. But there was still one lingering issue: Brian's refusal to sever ties completely. He had minimal, supervised visitation rights with Jamie, and it was during one of these court-ordered visits that Brian chose to confront me. I was ready for him. "Can we talk?" he asked meekly, the bravado he once carried completely deflated. "What's there to talk about?" I countered. "I want to apologize. For everything." I looked at him, searching for sincerity, but finding only desperation. "Is this because you want more time with Jamie? Or because you genuinely understand how deeply you've hurt us?" It's both," he stammered. "I didn't stand up when I should have. I failed you both. I was a coward." "You think an apology is going to fix everything?" I retorted. "No, but it's a start." At that moment, I had to make a choice. I could accept his apology, opening a door to a more civil future, albeit one forever stained by the past, or I could shut him out, forever branding him as the villain in my life story. "Your apology is noted," I finally said, keeping my voice steady. "But actions speak louder than words. If you're serious, you'll respect our space and abide by the court's decisions. That's the least you can do." Brian nodded, taking in the gravity of what I had just said. "I understand." With that, I knew that this chapter, at least, was closed. The final showdown wasn't as explosive as one might expect. No screaming, no dramatic confessions, just a simple exchange that laid down the terms of our new reality. But it was enough. It was closure. The next day, I received a letter from my lawyer. "All final paperwork has been processed," she wrote. "Your divorce is now complete, and the restraining order against Janet has been upheld by the court." As I put down the letter, I felt an unexpected emotion. Relief. It was finally over. The weight of the past years, the struggles, the emotional turmoil. It was all behind me now. In its place was a sense of raw, untapped potential. I was a blank slate, free to rebuild my life without the specter of Janet's cruelty or Brian's weakness holding me back. It was a freedom that came with its own set of challenges, of course, but they were challenges I was now eager to face. "I guess it's just us now," Jamie said to me that evening, his eyes meeting mine as we both acknowledged the magnitude of the journey that lay ahead. "Just us," I confirmed, pulling him into a hug. "And that's more than enough. We were a two-person team, but we were strong, united by a bond that had been tested and found unbreakable." And as I looked at Jamie, his face glowing in the light of our new beginning, I knew that we were ready for whatever came next. As I turned off the lights that night, I reflected on the profound shifts that had occurred. In seeking revenge against Janet and taking control of my life from Brian, I had found something far more valuable, myself. I had rediscovered my strength, my dignity, and most importantly, the fierce love that can only exist between a mother and her child. The war was over, the battles had been fought, and the final showdown had passed. I was the victor, but not in the way I had initially imagined. I had not just defeated Janet and divorced Brian. I had reclaimed my life, and as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the trials that had led me here. For it was through confronting these challenges that I had finally found my way back to myself, and to a future full of limitless possibilities.